Chapter 2 Consumers, the Art of King. Our goal is to make the life of the Soviet people still better, still more beautiful, and still more happy. Leonid Brezhnev. To live a life is not so simple as crossing a field. Russian proverb. It was late afternoon when I reached my friend's apartment. He was out, but his mother, a gaunt and aging lady who had weathered 18 years in Stalinist camps and exile after an early romance with communism, fell to musing about the differences among generations in Russia and the new mood of materialism. The middle-aged people, the people from 30 to 40 years old and a bit older, are what I call the generation of hungry children. She intoned quietly, dark brown eyes peering at me. In their childhood and youth they saw enough hardship for a lifetime. Today their attitude is, give us food and a roof over our heads and work, and do whatever you want politically. Give us the material minimum, we won't ask for more. These people, she was saying, were the Soviet counterparts of the American Depression kids. As she explained the motivations for their nascent materialistic urges. The pale winter sun slowly expired, but the shadows did not disturb her, and she went on without putting on a light. I know a family, she said. The father was a poor worker, absolutely unskilled and barely literate. His wife was a simple woman, too. They had 11 children. He worked in a factory, and the family lived in a dormitory, in a barracks, really. All lived in one big room. They had a curtain which they pulled across it, and they put the beds behind the curtain. They used to sleep in shifts. That was during the war, and after the war too. Those were terribly hard times. The mother died right after the last child was born. Now the children are all grown up and married and have their own children. They are still working-class families, but they live much better than their parents. Each now has his own apartment. Small, 1 or 2 rooms, but with conveniences. A stove, maybe a refrigerator. One has a car. Those 11 children have become 40 to 45 people now, including all the grandchildren. They get their subsidized passes through the trade unions for summer vacations. They work in different factories, one at a food enterprise, one in an electrical power plant, one at Ligachev automobile plant, the other in other factories. They all know how much better they live now than during the hungry years of the war and after the war. They simply cannot imagine that life could be any better. They think they have everything and that this is the result of their hard work and the system. They don't know anything else. Of course they are less interested in politics than people were in the first years after the revolution. Then I remember we were hungry, we were cold, but we were building socialism, and so we were willing to endure all that. But then after 15-20 years, we found that socialism was not all that good. And in 1937, things got so awful with the Stalinist terror, but people nowadays do not think so much about that. They think only about how their own life has gotten better. After the grim years of Stalin and the war, this lady applauded the new materialism, but other Bolshevik elders deplored and resented the new Burgessist mood. The press, too, sometimes sounded the foreboding note that Spartan socialist idealism was being eroded by acquisitiveness, one-sided orientation toward satisfaction of consumer demands, especially when it is not followed by the necessary indoctrination, is fraught with the danger of spreading social ills such as individualism, egotism, and greed, bleated Planned Economy, the Bible of Central Planners, in early 1975. But this represented a rearguard action, for Leonid Brezhnev himself set the tone for the 70s when, after consumer riots in Poland in December 1970, he pledged a 5-year plan favoring the consumer and saturating the market with consumer goods. No such dramatic inundation occurred while we were in Moscow, but living standards did improve in enough ways for long-neglected Soviet consumers to feel they were enjoying their best years since the Bolshevik Revolution. One of my own earliest impressions in Moscow was that people were better dressed than I had expected. There was nothing especially fancy or stylish that caught my eye. We arrived in fall, and the sartorial colors were somber, almost funeral, but I observed a cloth coat proletarian respectability on the sidewalks. Even if Muscovites were not sporting the latest mode clothes, they had a petite bourgeois instinct for keeping up appearances. They shunned the deliberately grubby dress or ripped, faded jeans that many urbanites in the West affected. Women's dresses were plain, men's suits were simple but durable-looking, even if unpressed, and in the parks I noticed co-eds in miniskirts and plastic knee boots, usually in outlandish pink and garish purple. I did not then fully comprehend how much better off Muscovites were than others. The Russians have a saying about this: Moscow is downhill from all of the Russias, meaning that the best of everything flows down into Moscow. But almost everywhere I traveled later, it was apparent that while American bourgeois materialism might be officially censored, the American middle-class way of life embodied the aspirations of a growing number of Russians, especially in the cities. People wanted their own apartments, more stylish clothes, more swinging music, a television set and other appliances, and for those lucky enough, a private car. We saw life slowly improving during our 3 years. Self-service stores and prepackaged food edged into the market. Some people felt affluent enough to afford wigs, pets, and even facelifting. Scientists announced that diets had improved so much since the war years that Russian children were 2 to 3 inches taller than their parents. At second-hand shops, wives of generals and regime riders bid against each other for czarist antiques and pre-revolutionary knickknacks that were ideologically taboo a decade ago. Some columnists complained about the occasional sale of cut-glass chandeliers for 1,000 rubles, women's rings for 2,000, and sable coats for 4,000. Readers debated in letters to Literary Gazette the ethics of young girls admitting that they judged prospective bridegrooms by how much they could earn and provide. Andrei Voznesensky and Yevgeny Yevtushenko satirized the new materialism in verse, but one columnist boldly declared in a youth newspaper that top workers merited 10 times the pay of lazy ones, and young people were right to demand more money for good hard work. Nothing more dramatically captured the onset of bourgeois acquisitiveness during my years than the belated Soviet romance with the private car. To provide an incentive for the elite and the growing middle class of engineers, technocrats, and middle managers, the Soviet leadership invested about $15 billion to build up its automotive industry from 1965 through 75. A large chunk of that went for truck factories, and a fair share of the eventual auto output was slated for export at cut-rate prices. Automobiles, once ridiculed by Khrushchev as foul-smelling armchairs on wheels, were making it in Soviet society at last. The West might be struggling to divorce itself from the pollution, congestion, and fuel problems born of its early marriage with the internal combustion engine, but in Russia of the early 70s, there was a giddy, newlywed excitement about cars. A Western ambassador told me that his wife had stopped one day for a red light in their imported Lincoln Continental, and a swarthy pedestrian, evidently from Soviet Georgia, motioned her to lower the window and then offered her 30,000 rubles for the car. When I was traveling in Armenia, a factory director proudly gestured to a couple of dozen cars parked in the lot outside his 5,500 worker plant and boasted to me, "Those are the private cars of our workers." An engineer whom I knew felt positively liberated by his car until it had had a breakdown, and talked ecstatically about the pleasures of traveling wild, that is, not bound by organized groups, bus routes, or set package itineraries for vacation. In the warm summer and early fall, the woods and fields around Moscow were sprinkled with the boxy little Zhigulis, Soviet-made Fiats, of people escaping the city. During my 3 years in Moscow, the number of private cars in the Soviet Union rose from 1.8 to 3 million, compared to nearly 100 million in America. Still, the private car remained well beyond the means of the average factory worker, who earns 187 a month. For the Soviet auto industry offered 4 makes and 8 models, ranging from the little Zaporets 968, a European minicar that puts along on 43 horsepower and sells for 3,500 rubles, to the Volga M124, a 5-seater that looks like a mid-size Plymouth but cost 9,150 rubles. The popular Zhiguli runs about 10,000. And there is no financing to help out. It's cash on the line. Russian friends told me that if the buyer is not fortunate enough to be on one of the special lists for the privileged class, the wait for a car can run from 1 to 5 years. I knew a journalist who had waited 6 years for a Volga and predicted it will be another 5 years before I get it. Actually, through connections, he landed one within the next several months. Those who have to wait normal rotation on the one citywide public waiting list get little choice of color or extras when their number comes up, but this seems to bother no one. Russians are delighted with whatever is available. The Soviet auto age has other idiosyncrasies that confound the foreigner. Traffic rules permit almost no left turns. The Soviet system is to go past the street you want, make a legal U-turn, and then come back, but sometimes the legal U-turn areas are few and far between. Gas stations operate on a pump-it-yourself basis, and no teenager comes bustling out to check the oil or wipe the windshield. Gas stations on inner-city routes have signs posted in several languages that act as a deterrent for anyone's demanding service. I was fascinated by one which said in English, "Front glass wiping 15 kopecks, side glass wiping 21 kopecks, back glass turn indicators and stop symbol wiping 15 kopecks, tire pumping and pressure checking per each wheel 15 kopecks." Another peculiarity is that Russian custom of driving at night using only parking lights, even on inner-city roads, none of which really qualifies as a highway in the Western sense. This makes driving after dark a nerve-wracking experience. I've nearly run into huge, poorly lit trucks or peasants walking by the roadside, all but invisible in their dark padded jackets. Not surprisingly, the Soviet accident rate is very high, much higher than in America. Unofficially, but reliably, I was told that roughly 45,000 people were killed in traffic accidents in '74, almost as many as the American total of 46.2, and roughly 10 times as bad a fatality rate in proportion to the total numbers of motor vehicles in both countries. Ultimately, however, it is service that is the car owner's main headache. Nowhere nearly enough service centers exist for the cars rolling off Soviet assembly lines. When I left, Moscow had 16 repair centers, 3 really huge ones, but the rest pretty modest, for handling 250,000 private cars. Ambitious plans were unveiled in '72 for setting up a nationwide service system for the Zigulis, but in mid-'74, the press reported that fewer than one-third of the 33 planned service centers had opened, and the rest were far beyond construction schedules. Even where centers are in operation, finding spare parts can be koshmar, as the Russians say, a nightmare, because Soviet industry is more interested in producing new cars than spare parts, which do not show much impact on the 5-year plan charts. I knew one car owner who mothballed a Volga sedan for several months because he was unable to replace a rear window. Another friend, an engineer, invited to drive us somewhere for a social outing one evening and had to apologize at the last moment because his car had broken down. A couple of months later, I asked him about it, and it still had not been put back in service. The spare parts shortage breeds pilfering of parts, even such petty items as side mirrors and windshield wipers, which are in as short supply as many bigger items. As a defense, Russian motorists generally remove their windshield wipers whenever they park or when the weather is good, and store them in their glove compartments. One of the most comical images I have of Moscow is the spectacle of busy traffic caught in a sudden heavy rainstorm. Drivers quickly wheel toward the curb, halt their cars, and then, like characters in an old Charlie Chaplin movie, jump from one side of the car to the other, bending carefully over the hoods in their suit or shirt sleeves, wincing at the touch of the raindrops as they fasten on their windshield wipers. Many is the time that I have joined that army of motorists at the curb in this frantic little jig. So far, only a small slice of Soviet society has entered the auto age, but the Soviet economy has laboriously provided other benefits for people less well off. By early '74, 2/3 of the nation's families had television sets, nearly 60% had sewing and washing machines, and about half had some kind of refrigerator. Wages had been rising steadily, enough for blue-collar workers in '75 to be averaging 1,728 rubles a year. Savings deposits had ballooned to more than 80 billion rubles, earning 2% interest. Noting the dramatic changes since the early post-war period, one American expert economist, Gertrude Schroeder, reckoned that from 1950 to '70, Soviet per capita food consumption doubled, disposable income quadrupled, the work week was shortened, welfare benefits increased, consumption of soft goods tripled, and purchases of hard goods rose 12-fold. But if the progress was striking, the shortfall was also staggering, I found. The dilemma for a foreigner engaging the Soviet standard of living is deciding which yardstick to measure it by. In terms of the Soviet past, it has come a long way. In terms of industrialized Europe and America, it has a long way to go. As Gertrude Schroeder observed, despite the impressive gains, the level of living of the Soviet people in 1970 was merely 1/3 of that in the United States, about 1/2 of that in England, France, and West Germany, perhaps a little below that even in Italy and Japan, and well below that in the East European communist countries of East Germany and Czechoslovakia. The gap may have narrowed by the mid-'70s, but only slightly. Not only Westerners who lived among the Russians reacted that way. An East German scientist who had been working in Russia for several years confessed to me that he was, appalled at how poorly ordinary Russians live. Other East Europeans reacted similarly. For in spite of Brezhnev's promise of a consumer-oriented 5-year plan, the nation's top economic planner, Deputy Prime Minister Nikolai Baibakov, admitted before 1974 was out that this promise and the loudly proclaimed consumer targets had proven unreachable, and the 1971 through 74 period, and that in 75. The leadership was quite openly going to give first priority to heavy industry. I was given a graphic picture of the hard-nosed priorities that had actually been operating all along by Viktor Perstev, the experienced red-faced construction boss at the high-prestige Kama River truck plant. 3 of every 4 rubles of investment, he explained, were going into the plant construction, and only 1 ruble out of 4 was going into building an entire city for 160,000 people, with all its housing, stores, services, recreation, and other facilities that had to be built from scratch. To speed up the construction of the truck plant and to combat absenteeism, Perstev said that they had imposed a ban on vodka, the Russian workers' solace and his employer's sorrow. With 50,000 workers stuck out in the middle of the windswept plains 650 miles east of Moscow, living in overcrowded dormitories and with limited leisure facilities, I asked him whether the town had a brewery. I found it hard to visualize such an army of construction crews without either vodka or beer. No beer plant, he declared. Come back in 5 years and we should have a beer plant. It's in the plan. Then he chuckled, but don't come back looking for a beer plant before that. We have to build the truck factory first. That kind of official judgment about Soviet economic priorities has a fundamental impact on the everyday lives of Russians as consumers. What Westerners are quick to ask for are the statistical comparisons of living standards, and they are usually impressed at how astonishingly cheap housing is, how much food costs, and clothing too. I remember a conversation on a flight to Tashkent with a woman who had 9 gold teeth and who worked in a textile plant with her husband. Together, she said, they earned about 210 rubles. 2/3 of it went for food to feed 3. They had a 3-year-old daughter, she said, and only 12 rubles for their 2-room apartment. The rest, 56 rubles, was split among clothing, transportation, entertainment, cigarettes, nominal taxes. But the figures do not begin to convey the texture of Soviet consumer life and the enormous gulf between the daily ordeal of the Russian shopper and the easy lifestyle of Americans. My Russian friends were amused to hear about American suburban housewives getting into the station wagon and dashing off to the supermarket or shopping center for groceries a couple of times a week, for they usually walked to the stores every day for food, often quite a long way, and had to go to several shops, one for bread, another for milk products, a third for meat, and so on. Some chose to buy the groceries downtown because the few supermarkets there were better stocked, and then had to lug packages home on bus and subway. Others had to shop downtown because many new apartment subdivisions go without basic stores for 2 or 3 years after they are first occupied because construction and commerce are so poorly synchronized. I have read any number of complaints in the press from people who said they had to walk a mile to get a pair of shoes repaired or to find some similar trivial but necessary service. Shopping generally resembles a grand lottery. I had heard about consumer shortages before going to Moscow, but at first it seemed to me that the stores were pretty well stocked. Only as we began to shop in earnest as a family did the Russian consumer's predicament really come through to me. First, we needed textbooks for our children who went to Russian schools and found that the 6th grade textbook had run out. A bit later, we tried to find ballet shoes for our 11-year-old daughter, Lori, only to discover that in this land of ballerinas, ballet shoes size 8 were unavailable in Moscow. At GUM, the celebrated emporium on Red Square with a water fountain and the Baroque atmosphere of a rambling indoor 1890s bazaar, I tried to find shoes for myself. They were out of anything in my size but sandals and flimsy lightweight shoes that the clerk, with one look at me, recommended against buying. They won't last, he admitted. Anne went out to buy some enamelware pans. Russians advised against getting the standard zinc aluminum because it leaves a taste in the food. Stainless steel, copperware, and Teflon do not exist. She scoured 4 major Moscow department stores and several smaller shops without any success. In other words, the stocks that had impressed me at first turned out mostly to be racks of suits and coats that were poorly made or had gone out of style, or the shelves of pots and pans and other unwanted items that Russian housewives refused to buy. In spite of the various tinkering reforms, the Soviet economy still operates by plan from above rather than in response to consumer demand from below, and this produces a lopsided assortment of goods. Goods are produced to fill the plan, not to sell. Sometimes the anomalies are baffling. Leningrad can be overstocked with cross-country skis and yet go several months without soap for washing dishes. In the Armenian capital of Yerevan, I found an ample supply of accordions, but local people complained they had gone for weeks without ordinary kitchen spoons or tea samovars. I knew a Moscow family that spent a frantic month hunting for a child's potty, while radios were a glut on the market. In Rostov, on a sweltering mid-90s day in June, the ice cream stands were all closed by 2 p.m., and a tourist guide told me that it was because the whole area had run out of ice cream, a daily occurrence. A visiting American journalist friend hunting flints for his cigarette lighter was advised by Russian smokers to forget it because Moscow had been without flint for a couple of months. The list of scarce items is practically endless. They are not permanently out of stock, but their appearance is unpredictable. Toothpaste, towels, axes, locks, vacuum cleaners, kitchen china, handy irons, rugs, spare parts for any gadget from a toaster or a camera to a car, stylish clothes or decent footwear, to mention only a few listed in the Soviet press. Traveling in the provinces, I have also noticed the lack of such basic food items as meat. In cities like Nizhnevartovsk and Bratsk, during winter, people had become so accustomed to the fact that the meat departments of food stores had simply shut down. I knew one young man whose family lived near Kalinin, a city of about 380,000, located 150 miles northwest of Moscow. He told me he never went to see his parents without taking meat because they were unable to buy anything at Kalinin but bologna and sausages. Quality is another nightmare for the Russian consumer. The generally tacky quality of Soviet consumer goods is too well known to require rehearsal here. Russians themselves turn up their noses at many goods, as shtepany, poured from the mold, the epitome of the cheapest output of mass production industry, or simply brok, junk that doesn't work or comes apart. Above all, goods without color, shape, style, or charm. For some reason, shoes are a particular headache. The newspaper Literary Gazette reported in late '73 that 1 out of 8 pairs of shoes produced nationwide had been rejected by inspectors and had to be discarded. When it comes to appliances, The American housewife who reads about Soviet goods and mentally pictures her own would be in for a rude shock. Even a Ukrainian researcher commented in '72 that 85% of Soviet washing machines were obsolete. No spin dry, no automatic controls. Each operation has to be hand started, and they take only 3 to 4 pounds of clothes, and that Soviet refrigerators are far behind foreign ones, about one-third capacity, and few with ice-making compartments. The obvious confirmation to me was seeing innumerable Soviet families still hanging their perishables out the window in a net bag in cold weather to keep them fresh. But that is an old story. What is new and revolutionary in the Soviet 70s is that Russian consumers are becoming fussier shoppers. The country folk may still buy practically anything, but urbanites are more discriminating and fashion conscious. They may have more cash in their pockets than ever before, but they are less willing to part with it. Yet because the supplies of consumer goods are about as unpredictable as the weather, and there is little effective advertising to help shoppers, Russians have developed a series of defense mechanisms to cope with the situation. They know that some Soviet factories, especially those in the Baltic republics, produce nice items, women's clothing with a bit of style, brighter men's shirts, good sleeping bags, radios, or outboard motors, and that these items sell out in a flash whenever they appear. So they prowl the stores incessantly, hoping to be in the right place at the right time, when, as the slang expression has it, oni vybroskyvayat chato tu kroshoy, they throw out something good, meaning put choice items on sale. For just that lucky break, women all carry a string. Bag and avoska, which comes from the Russian word for maybe, perchance, in other words, a string bag for the odd chance that you find something unexpected, because stores do not provide paper bags. Likewise, almost any man carries a briefcase wherever he goes. I remember thinking at first how studious and businesslike all these Russian men looked with their briefcases. Then one day I was talking with a well-established scientist in a park, and suddenly he reached into his briefcase. I thought that he was going to pull out some paper to illustrate a point he was making, but as my gaze followed his hand into the briefcase, I spotted a bloody hunk of meat wrapped loosely in newspaper. The scientist, who lived outside Moscow, had bought the meat to take home and was just checking to make sure it was not leaking badly. As time went on, I discovered that briefcases were far more likely to be loaded with oranges, hordes of toothpaste, or pairs of shoes than with books or papers. Another precaution is to carry plenty of cash at all times, for the Soviet system is devoid of credit cards, charge accounts, checkbooks, or easy loans. Installment credit is available only on items like the less desirable models of radios and television sets, which are grossly overstocked and not moving well. So to be ready for the happy chance of finding something rare, one sturdy blonde woman told me, you have to carry a lot of cash. Suppose you suddenly discover they are selling good knee boots for 70 rubles. You have to get in line right away. You don't have time to go back to your apartment and get money. The boots will be gone by the time you get back. One of the attractive qualities among Russians that this situation has fostered is an almost frontier readiness to share cash with friends and co-workers to help them make big purchases. Paradoxically, Russians have less money than most Americans, but are more instinctively generous with it to friends. People think nothing of borrowing or loaning 25, 50, or 100 rubles until the next payday, if they can spare it, and sometimes even if they can't. For most people, money is less important than a good opportunity to use it. Another cardinal rule of Russian consumer life is shopping for others. It is an unforgivable sin, for example, to run across something as rare as pineapples, Polish-made bras, East German wall lamps, or Yugoslav toothpaste without buying some extras for your best friend at work, your mother, sister, daughter, husband, brother-in-law, or some other kin or neighbor. As a result, I was amazed to discover people know by heart the shoe, bra, pant, and dress sizes, waist and length measurements, color preferences, and other vital particulars for a whole stable of their nearest and dearest, to be ready for that moment when lightning strikes a store they happen to be in. Then they spend until the money runs out. One middle-aged Moscow woman also told me how office workers organize shopping pools the way American housewives operate carpools and rotate the daily chore of shopping for food. In their little office collectives, she said, someone goes out to buy basic food items for all during the lunch hour to help everyone escape the terrible crush in stores after work. Often the women also take turns sneaking out during regular working hours to scout the main downtown stores for something special and return to sound the alert if reinforcements are needed for bulk buying. In such cases, a bit of petty profiteering on the resale is perfectly normal. A young man told me how he had seen one woman get on a bus with 20 tubes of popular Yugoslav Signal brand toothpaste in her Vodka. She was immediately inundated with questions about where she found it, and a few whispered offers to buy some at a premium. Buying imported goods is another line of defense among ordinary consumers, as well as the privileged class. Although few Western goods are available, even goods from Eastern Europe and third world countries have a certain snob appeal, and Russians will readily pay exorbitant premiums for them even when Soviet goods are adequate. I would rather pay twice the price for imported shoes than for Soviet-made shoes, a young tour guide in Vladimir told me. He was wearing Spanish shoes that cost him 35 rubles, or more than 1/3 of his monthly salary. Sales clerks even pushed the foreign items over Soviet-made. I stopped one night at GUM to buy some Soviet toilet goods as an experiment, but when I motioned to a box marked simply shaving cream in Russian, the sales girl steered me to a competing brand. Is it Soviet? I asked. No, she said, made in GDR, East Germany. It's better than ours. I then asked her about toothpaste. She recommended Murray from Bulgaria. But what about Soviet toothpaste? I asked. Do you have Soviet brands? Yes, of course, she said, regarding me as a rather odd customer. But this Bulgarian one is better. I insisted on a Soviet brand, orange-flavored. After one try, I understood why she had recommended the Bulgarian. It was a sour orange flavor that didn't blend with the dentifrice. Everyone wants imported things, a scientist observed. I remember an important lady, a friend of my wife, who was a high-party official at Moscow Film Studios. She was director of a department that edited movies, and he glanced over his glasses at me to be sure I caught his meaning. I remember, and this was 15 years ago, she used to say, I don't care if they say the material is bad. I want a dress that is imported, even such a person. Of course, it had no effect on her beliefs or her loyalty, but she wanted things from abroad because she regarded them as better and as prerequisites of the good life. In those days, people used to call them importny goods. Now they like to think they are more sophisticated, so the new term is firminy, from a firm with a trade mark, but actually it means the same thing. People want something that is not Soviet. Anything, a shirt, a tie, a handbag, any little thing at all, it makes them feel better than other people. The urge for a touch of class, for something better than others have, has put new pressure on that classic Russian institution, the key. Customers the world over wait in lines, but Soviet keys have a dimension all their own. Like the Egyptian pyramids, they reveal a lot about the Russian predicament and the Russian psyche, and their operation is far more intricate than first meets the eye. To the passerby, they look like nearly motionless files of mortals doomed to some commercial purgatory for their humble purchases. But what the outsider misses is the hidden magnetism of lines for Russians, their inner dynamics, their special etiquette. The only real taste of stoical shopping vigils in recent American history were the pre-dawn lines at service stations during the gasoline crisis in the winter of 73 and 74. That produced a wave of national self-pity in America, but it was temporary and only for one item. Imagine it across the board all the time, and you realize that Soviet shopping is like a year-round Christmas rush. The accepted norm is that the Soviet woman daily spends 2 hours in line, 7 days a week, daily going through double the gauntlet that the American housewife undergoes at her supermarket once, maybe twice a week. I noted in the Soviet press that Russians spend 30 billion man-hours in line annually just to make purchases. That does not count several billion more man-hours expended waiting in tailor shops, barber shops, post offices, savings banks, dry cleaners, and various receiving points for turning in empty bottles and so on. But 30 billion man-hours alone is enough to keep 15 million workers busy year-round on a 40-hour week. Personally, I've known of people who stood in line 90 minutes to buy 4 pineapples, 3 hours for a 2-minute roller coaster ride, 3.5 hours to buy 3 large heads of cabbage, only to find the cabbages were gone as they approached the front of the line, 18 hours to sign up to purchase a rug at some later date, all through a freezing December night to register on a list for buying a car, and then waiting 18 more months for actual delivery, and terribly lucky at that. Lines can run from a few yards long to half a block to nearly a mile, and usually they move at an excruciating creep. Some friends of ours living in the southwest part of Moscow watched and photographed a line that lasted 2 solid days and nights, 4 abreast and running all through an apartment development. They guessed they were 10,000 to 15,000 people signing up to buy rugs, an opportunity that came only once a year in that entire section of Moscow. Some burned bonfires to keep warm out in the snow, and the crackling wood and din of constant conversation kept our friends awake at night. Yet despite such ordeals, the instinctive reaction of a Russian woman when she sees a queue forming is to get in line immediately, even before she knows what is being sold. Key psychology has a magnetism of its own. Again and again, I have been told by Russians that anyone's normal assumption on seeing people up front hurrying to get in line is that there must be something up there worth lining up for. Never mind what it is, get in line first and ask questions later. You'll find out when you get to the front of the line, or perhaps they'll pass back word before then. A lady lawyer told me she once came upon an enormous line stretching all through the Moskva department store, and when she asked those at the end of the line what was on sale, they said they didn't know, or else snarled at me and told me not to interfere. I walked up 20 or 30 yards asking people, and no one knew. Finally, I gave up asking. Nina Voronel, a translator of children's literature, said she happened to be at an appliance counter one day buying an ordinary hand mixer for 30 rubles. when a clerk carried in a box of East German wall lamps. I told the salesgirl I'll take one, put me down for one, and I'll go pay the cashier. And while I went to the cashier, a line of about 50 people formed. How they found out about it, I don't know. Word spreads. That is the way we always learn here. Practically everyone in the store was there. It didn't matter whether they needed the lamps or not. People here don't just buy what they need, but whatever they see that is worth having. Some may sell those lamps, some may give them to friends, but mostly they keep them on the shelf. A lamp is always needed. Good fabrics are always needed. Fur coats, fur hats, good winter boots, bright summer dresses, floor rugs, dishes, enamel pots and pans, kettles, good woolen cardigan, sweaters, umbrellas, a decent purse, a nice writing table, a typewriter, a good woman's bra, not a floppy, ugly Soviet one, with no support and no adjustments, made for big-bosomed country girls, but a Czech bra or a Polish one, white and pretty instead of blue and baggy with rosebuds. That is why people are so quick to join a line. It might be any of those things. People form lines in a rush like ducks in a pond, racing for a piece of bread. In a Kiev department store, I was not far from the women's gloves counter when a voice nearby pronounced the words, "Imported gloves." I was nearly dashed against the counter in the crush. One particularly aggressive young couple squirmed to the front, examined the gloves over the head of another shopper, pronounced them not to be imported, and squeezed their way back out of the crowd. A few others near the front also drifted off, but the tail of the line held firm in its ignorance under a blue-coated store clerk until a blue-coated store clerk passed down the aisle behind them, pushing a cartload of nice-looking men's padded windbreakers. Like an ebb tide, the wave of shoppers flowed away from gloves and literally washed this poor clerk into a corner. Clearly she was unprepared to sell right there, but she escaped with her cargo into an elevator only when the front ranks had thoroughly quizzed her about prices, sizes, and which department would sell the jackets. Once formed, moreover, Soviet lines are more fluid than they appear. Eddies and undercurrents work within them. In most stores, for example, the shopper's ordeal is prolonged by the requirement to stand in not one, but 3 lines for any purchase. The first to select her purchase, find out its price and order it. The second to pay a cashier somewhere else in the store and get a receipt. And the third to go pick up her purchase and turn in her receipt. But in a dairy store one Saturday morning, I found out that the game is both simpler and more complex than that. I went in to buy some cheese, butter, and bologna sausage, which were unfortunately in 3 separate departments, each with its own line. 9 lines. I groaned inwardly, but rather quickly. I noticed that veteran shoppers were skipping the first stage. They knew what most items cost, so they went directly to the cashier for their receipts. After a bit of studying prices, that was what I did too. Then, receipts in hand, I went to the cheese line, the longest, probably 20 people, to get the worst over with first, but I was in line less than a minute when the lady in front of me turned around and asked me to hold her place. She darted off to the butter and milk line. The cheese line was moving so slowly that she got her butter and milk and returned before we had moved forward 3 feet. I decided to take the risk too, and got back with my butter while the cheese line was still inching along. Then it dawned on me that the entire store was churning with people getting into line, holding places, leaving, returning. Everyone was using the cheese line as home base. That was why it was barely moving. that kept expanding in the middle. So once again I got the elderly gentleman behind me to hold my place and went off to buy my bologna. Once again it worked. In the end it took me 11 minutes to buy butter, sausage, and cheese, and instead of being furious, I felt oddly as if I had somehow beaten the system with all those shortcuts. Line jumping, I was later advised by more serious shoppers, is accepted for ordinary items but not for scarce ones. Things get tense. Several women said, people know from experience that things actually run out while they are standing in line, advised one young blonde. So if the line is for something really good and you leave it for very long, people get very upset. They fly off the handle and curse you and try to keep you from getting back in when you return. It's up to the person behind you to defend your place in line, so it's serious business asking someone to hold your place. They take on a moral obligation not only to let you in front of them later on, but to defend you. You have to be stubborn yourself and stand your ground, in spite of the insults and the stares. And when you get to the front of the line, if the sales clerks are not limiting the amount, you can hear people, maybe 6 or 8 places back, shouting at you not to take so much, that you are a person with no scruples, or that you have no consideration for other people. It can get rather unpleasant. This competitive shopping gives a surface tension to Russian life, which as much as anything sets ordinary people off from the elite. An American journalist once compared shopping to going through Army basic training, where sergeants deliberately cut new recruits down to size. He had in mind the surely high-handed attitude of sales clerks who are poorly paid, often overworked, or simply lazy. Stories about waiting an hour in a restaurant for a waitress to take your order and then waiting half an hour more for her to inform you that they are out of what you ordered are legion. In Tashkent, an elderly woman told me she had gotten to the head of a meat line in a food store after a long wait, and then had to endure 5 more minutes while the butcher gabbed about sports with a friend. When she asked for some meat, she said he wheeled on her grumpily and said, "Next I suppose you'll want me to cram it in your mouth for you." So stereotype are rude sales clerks that Arkady Rakin, the leading Soviet comic, always makes a hit with a saleslady who totally ignores the request of some Soviet Casper Milquetoast asking for a gift for a middle-aged lady and insist on selling him a toy cannon. The attitude of sales clerks is part and parcel of the entire complex of the Soviet seller's market. They think, I am one and you are many, so why should I hurry? You have to wait for me anyway, a government worker explained to me, and they're right, of course. Where else can you go if they have what you want? In many stores, shoppers cannot help themselves because they are warily kept at arm's length from merchandise stacked behind counters, out of reach until the clerk is ready to serve them. Bread stores are an exception. There, customers are provided with metal forks for testing the freshness of the loaves. But in big department stores, customers are admitted only in small, controlled groups into roped-off sections for women's coats, children's boots, or sports gear. The advent of self-service food stores has begun to alter this chilly aloofness. But the change has been glacial, in part because Russians are so tradition-bound at the 2-story food market on Kalinin Prospect in downtown Moscow. For example, I noticed that people were used to bagged flour, sugar, and dry noodles, but many still preferred waiting in line to watch the salesgirl ladle out fresh yogurt into a jar brought from home than picking up a prepackaged container, even if it was quicker. Others have been deterred by what they regard as insulting spot inspections of shoppers' handbags in checkout lines, conducted to combat shoplifting. The Russian shopper's gauntlet is also complicated by the unpredictable interruption of service and store closings, far more than in other countries. Soviet stores observe cleaning days and inventory days when business comes to a halt, or the shopper can unexpectedly come upon a shop door marked Remont, which means repair, but which amounts to a universal cover-up for out to lunch indefinitely. In the provincial cities especially, stores just shut down to suit the staff, regardless of posted hours of operation. They work like their own bosses, a dejected countrywoman said to me in a Caucasian village, as we shared frustrations outside the only food store in the neighborhood. If they feel they have something to sell, they're open. If not, not. Other establishments arrange their own breaks with scant thought of customers, such as the buffet in the lobby of the Ukraine Hotel, which is closed from noon to 2 p.m., or Moscow's Gorky Park, which has the delightful practice in winter of flooding the pathways to permit skating through the woods, but regularly shuts down at prime time, Sunday afternoons from 4 to 6. What is more, as I learned painfully, ticket ladies refuse to sell admission tickets after 3 p.m. Not enough time for you to get ready, barked one woman, and no amount of persuasion could reverse her arbitrary edict. Russians are surprisingly phlegmatic about it all, but they look upon shopping generally as a form of physical and psychological combat, much as New Yorkers brace themselves for rush hour in the subways. People barge into stores, bump into each other, with faces set in glum, combative expressions, not bothering to thank someone for holding a door or stepping outside. Muscovites, as hardened city dwellers, have a reputation among other Russians for being particularly brusque. Periodically, some columnist will upbraid them for crude manners. Still, Russians who are marvelously warm-hearted in private are often surprised to hear that foreigners find them dour and unsmiling in public. You have to understand, said a kind, gray-haired literary critic, that for as long as we can remember, shopping was a struggle. Life is a struggle. Where you stand in line is serious business. That goes back to the war years, when if a boy did not get up early enough to get near the front of the line, he came home without bread that day. Of course, things are better now, but people still get that tense feeling when they shop. And the daily wear and tear, not just from shopping but work, diet, other strains of life, shows on them. They age more rapidly among people over 30. I found Russians tend to think Americans are 8 to 10 years younger than they are, and Americans think Russians are 8 to 10 years older than they are. One positive result of the consumer's eternal gauntlet, however, is that any unusual purchase is a possession to be prized and cherished. Russians are less materialistic than Americans, and yet they have a warm sense of extra pleasure and achievement over relatively simple things, much more than do Westerners for whom the buying is easier. In America, if your wife has bought a nice new dress and I noticed it, I will say, "Oh yes, that's nice, and that's all," suggested a woman journalist who had seen America and mixed with Americans. But in Moscow, when I get my hands on a pair of shoes that I like, it is an achievement, a feat, an exploit. It means that I have managed to work it out in some complicated way, through a friend, or perhaps I have found a sales clerk to bribe, or I have gone from store to store, and I have stood in line for hours. Notice how I put it, not simply bought some shoes, but got my hands on a pair of shoes. So when I get the shoes I like, I am very proud of them. And friends say to me, "Oh, ho, you have new shoes. Tell me, where did you get them?" And it is not just an idle, polite question. It is a real question because they are thinking, maybe she can help me get a pair. Maybe I can get a pair of nice shoes like that for myself. Americans simply cannot grasp that, can they? She was right, for I have seen that look of triumphant excitement in the eyes of women who have stood in line for an eon and just come away with a nice chignon or a Yugoslav sweater. It is a heartwarming sight. For most Russians, however, it is other elements of economic life which compensate for the obvious shortcomings of their consumer system and to make them prefer their socialism to the freer but less secure lifestyle of Westerners. The economic crisis of the West in the 70s have made some of them more confident about their own system lately, for all its faults. The double-digit inflation, unemployment, high cost of housing, medical care, and college education in America all dismay them. For many, the benefits of low-cost housing, free medical care, subsidized university education, and a guaranteed job above all, that job security outweigh the disadvantages of the marketplace. I remember one evening during a dinner in the apartment of an environmentalist who was an admirer of O. Henry's short stories and who entertained Anne and me with melancholy songs of the Volga on his guitar before the talk turned to economics. We know life here is not as good as it is in America, that your best workers make 3 and 4 times as much as ours, and your apartments and homes are bigger than ours, he said. But we don't have to save for unemployment here. I bring home my pay, give it to Lyuba, and she organizes the household. What do I have to worry about? There's enough money. You make much more than I do, but you have to save. You have to have reserves because any time you can become unemployed, and you have to worry about your retirement. Not me. I never have to worry. I have a specialty. I can walk out of my institute and get another job in my specialty, and I will make the same money, 220 rubles a month, without any problem. I can count on my 220 rubles. That is the big difference. I don't have to worry about the future as you do. These are comments repeated daily in the press, and practically as often when Russians meet Westerners, especially Americans. They have a certain validity, especially the point about unemployment. Soviet statistics about welfare programs always sound impressive, though the reality behind them often turns out to be a good deal less impressive. Government officials, for example, are fond of proclaiming that roughly 20 billion rubles are paid out annually in pensions. But when you discover that this sum is split up among 41.5 million pensioners, it works out to an average of 40 rubles a month, which is below the unofficial Soviet poverty line. In practice, many grandmothers and grandfathers have a cushion because they live with their grown children, and many also continue to work after legal retirement as low-paid watchmen, cleaning ladies, elevator operators, coat clerks, or maids, and the government encourages them to do so, but after all, that is not retirement. Similarly, the Soviet economy has been spared the rampant inflation of Western economies in recent years, but it has not been as inflation-proof as government officials claim. It is true that Russians still enjoy a subsidized subway ride for 5 kopecks, and they did as they did 20 years ago. Rents in state housing are fixed and held very low, 6 to 8 rubles a month for 2 rooms, kitchenette, and bath. A half-liter of standard-grade milk costs 16 kopecks now as it did a decade ago. Potatoes in the state store are still fixed at 10 kopecks a kilo. The beef price ceiling state stores is nominally unchanged at 2 rubles a kilo. Travel is cheap. A Russian can ride a train or plane 1,000 miles and spend only 50 to 60 rubles. Hotel rooms, usually shared with strangers, go for a ruble or two a night per bed. Subsidized vacation passes remain a great boon. 120 rubles for 26 days, rooms, and board in a modest rest house. Children's pioneer camp cost 9 to 15 rubles for 3.5 weeks, but for things like hotels, trains, vacation passes, or camps, the trick is getting space. Moreover, in my final weeks in Moscow in late 1974, ordinary people were privately scoffing at official claims that the retail price index actually gone down 0.3% since 1970. One middle-aged woman asserted that what had cost 5 rubles a year back now cost 7. A linguist estimated that to feed and clothe her family of 4, including 2 growing boys, was now twice as costly as in 1970. A doctor more modestly estimated the increase at 20%. Some Western economists have guessed that hidden Soviet inflation is running about 5% a year. In a few cases, prices have been openly increased. In 1973, they were doubled overnight on such luxury items as caviar, smoked salmon, furs, and jewelry, though prices on some television sets and radios came down about 20%. But the more frequent technique is to substitute new items at higher prices with little or no change in quality and to withdraw the older, lower-priced items. Another form of inflation takes place because of shortages that force people into the peasant free market in food staples, where meat and vegetable prices have risen greatly. In 1970, that universal currency of Russian life, vodka, went through a tricky hidden price rise. The famous old brands like Stolichnaya, selling at 287 rubles a half liter, simply disappeared from the Russian market to be exported, and a newer, harsher brand simply named Vodka came out at 3.62. In 1974, the old Zilui-1 car, the Soviet version of the Fiat 124, began gradually to be replaced by the Ziguli 3, a Fiat 125. The new Ziguli has a bit more power, more attractive interior, a warning light to show when the door is open, more chrome, and a few other minor modifications, but the price increase was enough to make both Italian and American car makers envious. The old one cost $7,333 and the newer one $10,000, a hike of 36% in one fell swoop. More mundane items are hit by such gimmickry too, from stockings to boys' outdoor jackets or food. One housewife talking about chickens told me that the cheaper varieties of young Friars have disappeared. Now the choice is mostly the better variety at 2.65 rubles a kilo, or imported Hungarian or Danish that cost more, or if you are really desperate, 3.4 a kilo for cleaned chicken. That is the main means of inflation here. The cheapest varieties cannot be found. Medium-priced items are rare, and the most expensive is what is offered, so the cost of living goes up even without changing prices. One vital sector that has essentially inflation-free has been medical care, and freedom from crippling medical bills is one of the prides of the Soviet system, especially in a period of skyrocketing medical costs in the U.S. My personal exposure to the Soviet medical system was limited to a couple of hours of tours to clinics that were scrubbed spick and span for foreign visitors. Once our children went for medical examinations to the diplomatic polyclinic, a faded beige building behind heavy iron gates in downtown Moscow, where people brought their samples in Nescafe jars, water bottles, and other assorted vessels because no medical containers were provided to a lab that was open for 1 hour a day. It took several calls to complete the examination, but the doctors, all middle-aged women, were pleasant and seemed competent, and Anne was very impressed with how thorough the medical examination was. In travels to Central Asia and elsewhere, I was struck that the general gains in Soviet healthcare were among the more dramatic achievements of the system in the half-century since Lenin declared, either the lice defeat socialism or socialism defeats the lice. Endemics have largely been curbed. Infant mortality has come close to the levels of the 15 most advanced countries. Life expectancy is up to 70 years. By 1970, the Soviet Union had the highest ratio of doctors to population in the world, 23.8 doctors for each 10,000 persons, compared to 15.8 in the U.S., and it had more hospital beds than America, 10.6 versus 8.2 per thousand, though one reason is that Russian doctors hospitalize some kinds of people treated as outpatients in America, such as chronic alcoholics. By Western estimates, the Kremlin spends about 5 to 6% of its gross national product on health care, compared to 7% in America. Soviet officials never tire of telling that security from financial disaster because of health problems is one of the most important and popular aspects of the system. Russians whom I know cited acquaintances of modest means and position who obtained virtually cost-free health care that would have been inordinately expensive in the West, including operations or treatment in distant hospitals and institutions. But privately, many Russians complained to me that their health system, like the rest of the consumer sector, was plagued by overworked doctors, shortages of medicine, poor equipment, and generally low-quality service. They mainly blamed the government's low pay to doctors and other medical personnel. Financially, doctors, who are mostly women, are near the bottom in pay scales, making about 100 to 130 rubles a month, less than average factory workers. Andrei Sakharov, the dissident physicist, rated the quality of health care as very low and sent his wife abroad for eye treatment. The head of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, Mstislav Keldysh, used an American specialist for heart treatments. Another well-known scientist said cautiously of the Soviet medical care system, it's spotty. Some doctors, some hospitals, clinics are good, others are poor. You can't tell which will be good and which poor. I'm talking about Moscow, of course. Out in the country, it's worse. A medical scientist who emigrated to America in '74 after working at one of Moscow's leading medical institutes praised Russian doctors as more humane than profit-oriented private physicians in America and endorsed the concept of socialized medicine. But you cannot imagine how poor is the general quality of medical service, he said. In Ryazan, a city of 400,000 where I grew up, they have very bad equipment. They lacked very simple things, medicines, for example. The qualification of the doctors is much lower than in Moscow, but the worst problem in the system is poor organization and bad nursing service. The nurses do sterilization very badly. After operations, even in our institute, which is one of the very top ones, we had a lot of sepsis, festering wounds, infections, and suppuration. The nurses were not clean enough. They made mistakes in operations. Our institute director became very angry because he would do beautiful operations, and then there were these infections. So often, the middle-level personnel do not receive good pay, and they are not reliable, not competent. Once I was in Kharkov, and I had to be operated on for appendicitis in an ordinary district hospital. It was so dirty that you could not imagine it. The sheets were gray from such long use. The clothes of the hospital workers were not clean enough. They took special care of me because I was from this important institute in Moscow. Still, I got an infection, and so did others. I saw one man die in my presence after an appendicitis operation because of this problem. As some Soviet doctors emigrated, along with other Jews in the 70s, both American and Israeli doctors who were trying to help them adjust to foreign medical systems were surprised to find Soviet doctors generally less qualified than they had expected. The gap is huge, I was told by a New Yorker helping to retrain Soviet physicians. Another was surprised to learn that a lady doctor from a leading Leningrad child care clinic did not know how to use an otoscope, a device for examining ears, and said when he asked her how she told whether the children had infections, she replied, "We were taught to pull on the earlobe, and if the child cried, it had an infection." An East German gynecologist whom I met in the Caucasus and who worked for 3 years in Leningrad shared this American assessment. The Soviets like to make big propaganda about their health system, he told me, but I have worked in their clinics and their ambulances, and the care is not good. They have very little medicine and medical supplies. There is a shortage of necessary equipment, of course. They have research institutes or special hospitals like the Kremlin Clinic. For important people, which are probably on the same rank with your American hospitals, with good specialists and supplies, but we in East Germany are, say, 15 years behind you in the general quality of care, and the Russians are way behind us. The government simply does not invest enough in ordinary clinics and hospitals. Ambulances take too long to get to people. In many cases they are called out to pick up drunks, and a patient with a heart attack must wait for 2 hours. Hospitals are overcrowded. Now they are building them with smaller rooms, say 6 to a room, but the ones I saw had many beds. Not a very pleasant atmosphere. The food is poor. Most families bring food to their relatives in hospitals, and they give money or gifts to the Sanitary, nurses' aides, so that bed linens will be changed regularly and things will be kept cleaner. The overcrowding and delays in getting admitted to hospitals are mentioned by many people. For emergencies, it is not a problem to get into a hospital. Emergencies are treated at once, said a Moscow doctor. But for planned operations, non-emergencies, dealing with chronic conditions and therefore scheduled by plan, it is a problem everywhere. A Moldavian power engineer told me he had waited several months for an abdominal operation in Kishinev. At Moscow's Institute of Cardiovascular Surgery, 3 years, even 5 years, is not an unusual wait, said one scientist. At less prestigious institutions, the time lag is shorter but considerable. The East German doctor dismissed my comments about the diplomatic polyclinic in Moscow. You have a special hospital for foreigners, where the service is much better than a hospitals for Russians. He said, even so, I knew Western patients who had been hospitalized there and were unnerved by the unsanitary conditions. Others were surprised to learn that in minor operations, such as abortions and appendectomies, Russian doctors use Novocaine rather than general anesthesia, and that almost all dental care, except tooth extractions, is done without any painkillers. The cheapness of medicines, often under $1 for prescriptions, is one of the great pluses of the system, but it is frequently cancelled out by shortages. This is one problem that Russians complain about quite openly. Even the press periodically chides the drug industry for shortages of such standard medicines or medical ingredients as glycerin for heart patients, tincture of iodine, ammonium hydroxide, Novocaine, even first aid kits and tourniquets, let alone sophisticated antibiotics. One doctor told me that there were standing instructions for doctors not to prescribe medicines they knew were out of stock. Like many other foreign residents in Moscow, I was frequently approached by Russian friends with urgent pleas for help in obtaining critically needed medicines, unavailable at any price in Moscow. Nonetheless, for most Russians, such problems are outweighed by the improvements over the past. They regard the system of free healthcare as one of the most positive features of Soviet socialism. Housing, perhaps more than anything else, illustrates the peculiar combination of triumph and tragedy for Soviet consumers. Staggering achievements have been made, yet staggering shortcomings remain. In the 20 years since 1956, roughly 44 million new units of housing have been built by the state, private and cooperative buildings, more than in any other country in the world. In the first half of this decade, 35 billion rubles were allocated for housing construction, and in 1975 alone, the target was to give more than 11 million people better living quarters, more than half of them in new buildings. The visible impact of the Soviet housing program is striking. Westerners return after a 10-year absence and marvel at the rows of paneled prefab 9-story, 11-story, and 14-story apartment houses that dominate the outskirts of Moscow and other large Soviet cities. The monotony of their architecture and their inhuman size are numbing, and their interiors are much humbler than their grand facades. But the scale of effort is impressive. Almost everywhere that I went, I encountered scholars, engineers, workmen, teachers boasting about their new apartments. They might be modest by Western standards, but they were bright and airy enough to produce a new outlook on life for those who previously had been crammed into communal flats, sharing kitchen, bath, and toilet with 4 to 6 other families. You cannot imagine how important a change that is for people, a middle-aged teacher asserted. Yet so massive and aching is the housing shortage that Western economists like Gertrude Schroeder still reckon that the Soviet Union is the most poorly housed of any major country in Europe, and poorly housed also by comparison with the Soviet government's minimum standard for health and decency. The Russian sanitary housing norm was set back in 1920 at 9 square meters of living space, equal to a 10 by 10 foot room, as the minimum for each person. Yet more than half a century later, Henry Morton, an American expert on Soviet housing, found that the great majority of Soviet people in urban areas have not reached the 1920 minimum level. More than 25% of them still live in communal apartments. Soviet officials concede, and Western specialists think the figure may be closer to 1/3. In 1972, the national average was 7.6 square meters of living space per person in the Soviet urban areas, or about 1/3 the space of American city dwellers, and 1/2 the space of people in Western European cities. And within the Soviet Union, Moscow and the Baltic capitals of Riga and Tallinn were far better off than less developed cities like Tashkent, Yerevan, Dushanbe in Central Asia and the Caucasus. The problem, however, is more human than statistical. To give me a picture of it, Moscow friends took me one gray November afternoon to an old section near the Rzhevsky bathhouse just off Peace Avenue. Hundreds of people were milling about for hours, like pickets on strike, hands thrust into their pockets, scarves wound tightly against the cold, carrying placards or hand-scrawled signs pinned to their leather jackets and sturdy cloth coats. Occasionally they would pause to converse quietly in twos and threes and then walk on. Despite the resemblance, they were not picketers. They were walking want ads, Muscovites advertising their apartments for exchange, anxious to improve their living quarters. One modish young couple passed us offering an attractive split, the exchange of a 4-room apartment, very large by Soviet standards, for 2 smaller ones because, as newlyweds, they wanted to move out from living with their in-laws. An elderly woman was trying to coax a man in a dark fedora to take single rooms in 2 different communal apartments in exchange for his separate 1-room flat. Kitchenette, bath, and toilet are automatically included, except in communal flats. Everyone understands that dining rooms are non-existent and that daytime parlors become bedrooms at night. 4 people, a couple, their child, and a babushka living in 2 rooms is standard, even good, if the rooms are big. Trades were slow that Sunday. It was mostly a day for looking, asking, mumbling, conferring, rejecting, and passing on. At the far end of the lane, however, there was action. There, students and military officers were swarming around a few landlords offering a small apartment, a room, or even just a bed for rent. One young woman, surrounded 5 deep on all sides, had a single room in a downtown location, but rejected a well-dressed army major as a tenant, evidently afraid he would bring his wife and child from out of town into the apartment. Her place was too crowded for that, she said. A tall, husky man with wavy silver hair and a thick navy blue jacket caused a stir by offering a 2-room flat in an old building with gas heat. The water and toilet are in the backyard, he said. That turned off 2 young men. Who wants that? Said one, as they left in disgust. But a middle-aged woman, terribly intent, was undeterred. She wanted it for her daughter and a friend, 2 girls in medical school. They are very good girls, straight A students, she said. I don't care if they get A's or D's, the landlord replied. I don't want students. They'll turn it into a dormitory. You want a family? Asked a brown-haired young woman at the fringe of the circle around him. He nodded, and she shouted over her shoulder, Kotik, come here. Everyone laughed. Kotik means pussycat, usually a private endearment in Russian. Kotik came over, dark curly-haired, handsome, in a zippered jacket, about 26. Questions about the apartment flew back and forth. Then the landlord cross-examined the prospective tenants. What's your profession? He asked. I'm a postgraduate, Kotik answered. You have registration to live in Moscow. The landlord wanted to know, obviously anxious to avoid what is a long and usually fruitless wrangle with authorities to get such registration. Yes, temporary registration, said Kotik. And what about your wife? He asked, looking at the young woman. I'm not his wife, she said candidly. Well, what about her? Said the landlord to Kotik, less interested in personal relations than official documents. She has Moscow registration, Kotik assured him. How much is the apartment? 50 rubles a month, paid a year in advance, the silver-haired landlord declared confidently. The figure was triple the price of a similar apartment in a new building which would offer indoor plumbing and other conveniences that this apartment lacked, but the housing squeeze is so tight that the couple happily took it on the landlord's terms, sight unseen. The 3 of them walked off to fill out the necessary papers. The Rezhsky Bathhouse Housing Exchange is one of 30 in Moscow, one of hundreds across this vast country of 250 million people. Many cities like Moscow put out a local apartment exchange bulletin. People become expert at reading between the lines, sorting out less attractive, noisy, 5-story Khrushchev housing from better-built, more up-to-date apartments. Avoid the top floors because the roofs usually leak, one Moscow apartment hunter advised. and the bottom floors because they're noisy and you don't have privacy. A flat that comes with a telephone is a real advantage, otherwise it's almost impossible to get one. Check for whether the building has garbage chutes. Exchanges often take months to work out because of the intricacies of meeting various space registrations set by the state. They can involve 5, 6, 7, even a dozen families in one huge musical chairs arrangement. A wiry, mop-haired underground artist whom I knew had a 2-room apartment, but wanted more space after the birth of a second child. He and his wife searched for weeks without luck. They persuaded his well-off parents to throw their 4-room apartment into the bargain, in hopes of getting 2 3-room apartments, but that too fell through. Finally, they found one 3-room apartment, but it was being used as a communal home for 2 families and a single elderly man. So the artist and his wife set out to help all these people arrange their own intricate little exchanges. When the deal was finally consummated, it involved 6 apartments and 8 families. The elderly man, not entirely happy with his new quarters, had to be paid 500 rubles cash to move. Then the entire arrangement had to be registered with city authorities, who scrutinized every detail to ensure that no one was visiting the Byzantine restrictions of maximum and minimum living space for different categories of people. Scholars, certain officials, and war invalids get special allowances and so on. And the police had to check that everyone was legally registered in Moscow to guard against interlopers from the provinces. It took an enormous amount of time and effort, but it was worth it. In the end, the artist told friends. We got a very nice apartment. Sometimes the endings are not so happy. Yuri Trifonov, a well-known fiction writer, published a story called Exchange that illustrated the ends to which people can be driven by the housing squeeze. In his story, a son and daughter-in-law connive to move the man's mother, who is dying of cancer, out of her lifelong apartment in order to expand their own living quarters before she dies, and her apartment automatically reverts to the state. Other writers and many private individuals blame the housing squeeze for the high divorce rate in the Soviet Union, among the world's highest. A Leningrad playwright in a moving drama, Don't Leave Your Beloved, captured the pathetic agonies of a couple who go through divorce and then are forced to continue living together afterward because they cannot find other housing. Nor is this just fictional fantasy. I was told of specific cases where it happened in real life. Soviet demographers attribute the small size of Russian urban families, usually 1 child per family, to tight housing. The press frequently blames high labor turnover in Soviet industry to the failure of enterprises or construction projects to provide adequate housing. Often, housing is more important to workers than pay scales. One engineer physicist whom I knew quit his regular job for a year and a half to help build a new apartment house outside Moscow in order to get a new apartment, a tactic used by many to improve their housing. This man was living with his family of 3 in a 9-room apartment with 54 other people. Eventually they got a 2-room apartment of their own, but they found the new housing area largely bereft of stores and convenient public transportation. The wife told me it took nearly 2 hours commuting each way to their old jobs. After a couple of years, they gave up and moved back to their old communal apartment. By then, only 27 people were living there. One reason why demand for housing remains so strong is that Soviet rents, heavily subsidized by government, are so low. But the main reason for the housing shortage, in spite of the construction of the past 2 decades, is the appalling legacy of the Stalin period, when housing was given near rock-bottom priority. Add to that the rapid growth of cities and the devastation during the war in European Russia, Byelorussia, and the Ukraine, and you have the ingredients of the desperate housing situation after the war. Too much of the effort in recent years has gone into keeping up with the population growth and migration into cities. While 44 million new housing units went up from 56 to 75, the population also grew by 45 million. Since '62, one outlet for more affluent families has been the development of cooperative apartment groups at governmental agencies, enterprises, scientific institutes, or cultural organizations. The normal Soviet practice requires a 40% down payment and then 15 years to pay the balance. As demand has risen, so have prices. Friends told me that a comfortable three-room apartment that used to cost 6,600 rubles in '66 would now cost 85 to 10,000 in a new cooperative. Although Westerners would regard that as cheap, Soviets on monthly salaries of 400 or so find it steep. Moreover, cooperatives are available only to affluent Russians, and they account for only about 3% of all urban housing. In many ways, the housing situation typifies Soviet consumer life in the mid-70s. Their standard of living is improving noticeably, but it is still nowhere near the level of the West, especially America, against which Russians are keen to measure themselves. The Kremlin has made concessions to consumers, but Russia is far from being a consumer society. The commitment to consumers, for example, was repeatedly downgraded in the first half of the decade, rather than let anything interfere with the Kremlin's tremendous drive to achieve nuclear parity with Washington, to build up the Soviet Navy, or to continue heavy Soviet economic aid to the Arabs. The average Russian, it seemed to me, is still regarded by his leaders more as a producer than as a consumer, and the concessions made to him are made with that in mind, to provide incentives for greater production. It is true that expectations of Russian consumers are rising, but what is often surprising to Westerners is that, given a half a century of sacrifices, they are not rising more rapidly or more insistently. Despite its worries, for instance, the Kremlin never faced that kind of explosive consumer dissatisfaction that shook the Polish government in 1970. Toppled Gomulka and forced concessions to Polish consumers, the Soviet leaders have been more successful than those in any other industrialized economy in persuading their people to defer gratifications, to take less now for promises of a better, though ever-receding future. They are willing to stand in line, literally or figuratively, for longer than most people. In the Caucasus, once I fell to talking about Russian cars with a chauffeur in his 50s who was taking us on a long tourist excursion, a man who was then making 95 rubles a month after 25 years as a driver. I asked him which car was best in his opinion, Volga, Ziguli, Zil, or Chaika, or some other car, meaning possibly a foreign one. He began his answer with prehistory. The Pobeda was good in its time, he ventured. The old model Volga was good in its time. This new model Volga is better. I've never driven a Ziguli or Zil or Chaika. Technology develops. Each one is better than the one before, but each was better in its own time. All were good in their time. To me it was a terribly Russian reply. It projected the total unawareness of the ordinary Russian, especially of people past 40, that at each stage there had been better cars produced somewhere else, as well as the uncritical acceptance of each model as it came along. The young and the urban middle-class intellectuals might lust for consumer items from abroad, but more ordinary working folk, like this driver, took life as it came, with modest improvements. Paradoxically, even some of those who gripe about Soviet goods and shortcomings also comment in their next breath that their lives are better than ever. It may be hard for you to understand, but you must understand that the majority of people here are satisfied with their lives. I was told by a scientist who was himself highly critical of the Soviet system, many of them have city apartments. They may seem small to you, 2 or 3 rooms, small rooms, But these people remember that their parents lived in the countryside in those izbas. You know what they are, those wooden houses with absolutely no conveniences. Now here they are with their city apartments, and there have been other improvements. These people don't even stop to think that there have been improvements elsewhere in the world too. They don't compare themselves with you. They compare their situation with their own past, with their parents, and they see that there have been great improvements, so they are satisfied.